Hi there, folks. It's time for us to do our very last lecture, and that is going to be over the interaction between the world of journalism ethics and sports journalism. Uh, as a part of that, we sort of have to think about what we have to guide us into making ethical decisions, and primarily that is the SPJ Code of Ethics, where we get stuff like the importance of taking accountability for our own work and being cautious when making promises. There's a lot of good rules and guidelines in here for behaving ethically as a sports journalist. But sports itself, in the act of being a sports journalist, does create a lot of very unique areas where traditional journalism ethics kind of fall short of giving us a clear enough answer. For example, if we pull the SPJ Code of Ethics, it says refuse gifts, favors, fees, free travel, and special treatment, and avoid political and other outside activities that may compromise integrity or impartiality or may damage credibility. Well, think about that first little bit there, the refusing gifts, favors, fees, travel, and special treatment. Think about how if you are a working journalist and you are covering a sport, one of the things that you get is access to that game for free. And you get your own little special section to sit in. And oftentimes you're given a free lunch while you're there to cover the said sport. And so it becomes a question of, hey, is that stuff technically special treatment? Getting into the stadium for free, getting your own place to sit with a good place to watch it from, a good seat, right? Is that special treatment? And there's some other gray areas noted in a recent poll of sports journalists. So here's some questions you can ask yourself as a potential sports journalist on ethically if reporters should be allowed to do this or not. This is something that if we were actually in person in lecture, we would have longer debates where I would ask you your opinions and feedback on this. Unfortunately, we're not because of COVID-19. But it's stuff like, hey, should sports reporters be allowed to share notes with other reporters? So if you are interviewing an athlete, or a coach, you get a really good anecdote or a quote, and you have a reporter at another publication, maybe across the country, that you're good friends with. Can you share that interview, even though you were the one who conducted it, with them? Most sports reporters say, yeah, that's probably fine. But the questions get more difficult from there, right? So should sports journalists switch between writing columns and covering games? Now, if we were to ask this question about 10 years ago, the answer would be no, it's very unethical. Your columnists are your columnists and your sports writers are your sports writers, and those two should not go with each other. That has changed rapidly over the last 10 years to the point that now it is pretty regular practice for sports reporters who are doing regular game coverage to also write columns. You don't see this as much on the news side of things, but in sports, it has now become pretty regular practice for columnists who are in the business of telling their opinion to also be the folks who cover stories straight down the middle and only provide the facts of the game. The rapidly increasing legality of sports gambling. So sports gambling used to be pretty illegal in the United States, and it's becoming more and more legal as time goes on. Is it okay for a sports journalist who's covering a game or covering maybe the same league or the same team to place a wager on a game officially, legally, as a sports bet? A lot of the answers are that, hey, if it's a game you are covering or if it's even a team you're covering, probably not a good idea to do that. And even if it's the same league, probably not a good idea. But a lot of people have not seen much of an issue with, hey, if you are a college basketball reporter, for example, you could probably put a bet on an NHL game because you're not going to cover hockey. Is it okay to vote in polls? College football has built its postseason system for a very long time on poll rankings. And the people who are voting in the poll are usually some combination of media, if it's the AP poll. So it is essentially then the sports reporters who are determining the outcome of where these teams are going to be in their consideration for the postseason. So where is the ethical questions that come up in that? It is now the reporters actually impacting and affecting the game. Should you score a game? Let's say you're a college basketball reporter, but let's say a local high school asks you to score a game, to be the official designated scorekeeper because you know so much about sports. If you do that, does that mean that you can then no longer cover that team or cover that area of high school basketball, even if you wanted to effectively? It's a question to consider. And then in terms of the questions we have for ourselves, a lingering question is, write for a media guide or write something that would be in a media guide, right? Especially if it's a high school. At that point, then you are a journalist who's actually then performing PR on the side. And is that okay? We don't have perfect answers for this. As with most cases, we learn a lot by examining past case studies. So past situations that reporters or the news media that's covering sports has found itself in when sort of dealing through an ethical dilemma. And one of the ones that I like to use for this conversation goes back to the 2015 World Series. And a pitcher for the Kansas City Royals named Edinson Volquez, his father had unfortunately died earlier in the day. The media, because of the way that the sports media had contacted the family, the sports media knew that his father had passed away, but he, the pitcher himself, did not know. American news media tends to follow a general rule, which is not to run a story disclosing details of the death until the immediate family has been informed. If you remember, this was a little bit of a question back when Kobe Bryant died earlier in this semester. When is it acceptable for the news to run the story, breaking news that this person has passed away, when we don't know for a fact that their family has been notified of their death? It all started when ESPN Deportes reporter Enrique Rojas, who's been a very good reporter for them for a long time, found out the death and ran it because he was told by another family member, it was a cousin of Volquez's, who knew about the father passing away, and the cousin told Rojas, and Rojas went with the story. There was sort of a missing step, though, in that Rojas did not verify with the cousin that Volquez himself knew about the death. But because the ESPN Deportes ran with the story, then other media sort of assumed that it had been properly vetted because it's ESPN, right? If it's ESPN, then it's probably legit. And so then ESPN, the regular ESPN, not just ESPN Deportes, ESPN ran the article, as did the Associated Press and the New York Times. They picked up the story at the beginning of the game because it was a big story. The idea that a starting pitcher on a World Series team, his father would have passed away earlier in the day. That's a big feature story. That's an emotional part of why we watch sports. USA Today ran with it. Royals Edinson Volquez learned of his father's death after the World Series start. This ended up being the rub because he didn't actually know. He didn't find out. The pitcher himself did not find out that his father had died until after the game or after his start in the game. So in the article that USA Today picked up on, it says it was an eerie feeling keeping a secret from the man pitching the biggest game of the season for your club and not quite sure you were doing the right thing. The national television audience knew it. Most of the fans at Kauffman Stadium knew it. The Kansas City Royals management, even some of their players knew it. But Edinson Volquez didn't know a thing. He just knew that he was upset being taken out of Game 1 in the World Series Tuesday night. Then when he walked into the Royals clubhouse in the 7th inning, 7 full innings before the Royals would win 5-4 in 14 innings over New York Mets, Royals GM Dayton Moore was awaiting him. Moore ushered Volquez into the manager Ned Yost's office and closed the door. His wife, Roandry, and 2-year-old twin daughters were waiting. They broke the news to him. Volquez's father, Daniel, a hardworking mechanic who provided him with his first baseball club, was dead. He died earlier in the day in the Dominican Republic after battling a heart disease for several years. He was 63. The quote, "The whole time I kept thinking Eddie was out there pitching his tail off," Yost said. Quote, "and I kept thinking his dad isn't watching him. His first start in World Series, and his dad isn't watching him." And the story goes on. You can pause it and read it if you want to. But it was this really intense situation where everyone knew, but no one had actually told the guy himself. And Fox Sports, who was carrying the game, was sort of one of the lone holdouts. Fox broadcasters refused to say it on air until they knew for a fact that Volquez was off the mound and would have had time at that point to confirm officially that he would have been told. And it seems like they were the only ones who actually did this sort of correctly. There's a sports writer named Will Leach who was covering this game live, who wrote a really good thing about it, a really deep thing about it, that said, Fox made sure not to mention the death on the broadcast until after Volquez was removed from the game so that the information could be relayed to him in an appropriate manner, a request that came from the team. So it was the team that had requested this. From New York Times, quote, the team then asked the broadcasters on Fox not to announce the news because Volquez routinely goes into the clubhouse between innings and the broadcasts of the game are usually on. That unofficial embargo didn't stop Rosenthal and thousands of other people tweeting about it, or Kansas City officials tiptoeing around him and hoping he didn't happen to look at his phone, or say fans in the stands who might have been checking Twitter during the game. It was a secret we all decided to keep. It made us all complicit. Imagine Volquez leaving this game and learning about his father. He might not realize it yet, but he will learn eventually that the public knew before he did. Imagine what comprehending that must feel like. It was, intentionally or not, a psychological invasion. He must feel in an emotional way violated. How could he not? This was a staggering, epic baseball game in which just about everything happened at least once. But nothing was more existentially bizarre and extremely disturbing than watching the home team starting pitcher at the precise moment he has devoted his entire professional career to reaching, be unaware that his father had died. I understand why it happened. I understand this is the way the world works now, but I feel disgusting. I feel like I know something about Volquez I have zero right to know. This was one of the most unforgettable baseball games I have ever attended, but not in the way it was intended to be. The Washington Post picked up on it as well with the headline, Why Fox Held the Story of Edinson Volquez's Father's Death, even when most viewers already knew. And they said the prevalence of social media, the spectacle of the World Series, and some of the most awful news imaginable created a journalistic quandary Tuesday night for Fox Sports. Broadcasters and producers possessed a piece of widely known information essential to the story of Game 1. If they delivered it to viewers, they believed there existed a non-trivial chance they would also inform a man on live television of his father's death. Cases, and this is what the SPJ put out afterwards, because a lot of people were looking for guidance on how in the world do you handle this situation. And SPJ said cases that justify immediate reporting without concern for whether the family knows are rare. As much as I care about this World Series, more on that later, this was actually someone who works for SPJ. I didn't need or want to know this news before the man's son knew it. Being first with the story didn't mean you won a journalistic race, that you raced past a journalistic principle. The ESPN report cited a, quote, family source, and I don't know whether the report was right or whether the Royals account was right, but being first with the story doesn't meet the standards of using unnamed sources, so I can't justify the decision, even though ESPN apparently thought Volquez knew the news. Let's look at another example. This is another slightly maybe a little more lighthearted example of when sports journalists have to decide something very importantly. And it involves this fella, Steve Bartman. If you don't know the tale of Steve Bartman, I'm sort of amazed. It was a big deal when it happened. Okay, here's the context. The Cubs were 5 outs away from going to the World Series for the first time since 1945. And at the time, the Cubs had not won a World Series since 1908. They have since won a World Series, but at this point, it was still in their very long dry stretch. And there was a foul ball popped out. And as it came towards the sideline, Steve Bartman, the guy in the blue hat and the green, dark black turtleneck sweater thing, sort of makes a grab at it. If you actually look at it, I don't think he really interfered that much, but that's just my own personal opinion. Either way, after it happened, everyone around him got real mad because they thought he had cost the Cubs an out. Security guards ended up having to escort Bartman out of the park in the middle of the game because people, as the game progressed, were getting more and more mad. They started chucking garbage and beer bottles down at him, and security got the sense that it was a bad idea for him to be there, so they actually asked him to please leave the stadium. people started making signs, one of which included one that said, "Kill that fan." Reporters wanted to know who was this dude. So if you're a sports journalist, at some point you're going to want to try to find out who in the world this guy was that maybe cost an out, maybe not, but at least was in the center of some big controversy in the middle of this game. The Cubs organization wouldn't release the person's name without put out a statement out saying, quote, "We would also like to remind everyone that games are decided by what happens on the playing field, not in the stands. It is inaccurate and unfair to suggest that an individual fan is responsible for the events that transpired in Game 6. He did what every fan who comes to the ballpark tries to do, catch a foul ball in the stands. It's one of the things that makes baseball the special sport that it is." So the Cubs they say they're not going to put the name out, and they try really hard to get everyone to calm down. It became a bit of an ethical question, which is, given the potential danger to the guy, to Steve Bartman, should he be identified by media, or if the media identifies him by name, are they putting him at some sort of physical risk? Well, it was the Chicago Sun-Times who discovered who he was, and the person who made the decision to publish the person's name in a quick article in the Chicago Sun-Times said this: "He was the center of a national news story, and there was no legal or moral problem in naming him. We did not think there was a serious possibility of his being assassinated by fans. We decided to go with the story and tell readers what we knew." So they went with the idea that it's just sports. It's in all likelihood, no one's really going to go hurt the guy. And it really did happen. Now, because the Chicago Sun-Times went with it, Chicago being a two-newspaper town, the Chicago Tribune decided then afterwards that they had no choice but to put his name in print. And afterwards, the SPJ weighed in and said this: "Journalists could have asked him if he wanted to be identified before doing so. This was not a case where the public needed to know his identity, and in retrospect, Bartman has never surfaced again from his momentary unwanted celebrity. It was thrust upon him against his will. He was the victim of fate and happened to be where the foul ball fell from the sky." So SPJ said, hey, the best thing to do in this scenario is just once you find out who he is, once you can make contact with him, just ask him, hey, are you personally worried for your safety if we choose to run your name in the paper? And if he says, yeah, maybe don't. And by the way, if you want to read more about or sort of learn more about this whole situation, ESPN did a really great 30 for 30 on this called Catching Hell. And then in a nice turn of events, when the Chicago Cubs did win the World Series for the first time in quite some time a few years ago, they did make a World Series ring just for Steve Bartman because the organization felt bad for everything that he had gone through up to that point. Okay, so with that, that is the last video lecture of the semester. Isn't that cool? Sorry that the semester turned out the way it did in terms of class being weird, not having sports to cover and all that, but I'm really proud of y'all. You made the absolute best out of it you could, and I'm super looking forward to reading your feature stories. All right, see y'all.